Our sermon today is meant to be words of encouragement for our seniors, whether it's seniors from high school or seniors from college. It's meant to be an encouragement to all of us that this faith journey, whether you're starting out at the beginning or whether you're at long into the faith journey, that there are still things to learn about God and His grace. And so I'm going to actually teach to you this morning, either whether you're at home or whether you're here, a story that's very familiar to you. It's out of the book of Genesis. It's the chapter 3, and it's part of what we call the creation stories. So chapter 1 of Genesis gives us a poetic narrative that teaches us that when God was creating the world, He brought order out of chaos, and it was good. And then in chapter 2, he begins to teach us about how the world was inhabited, and it's a narrative for chapter 2. And in this narrative, he teaches us about God's first created humans and His relationship with them. And then you get to chapter 3, which is where we're going to focus today, and most people call this the fall, which sounds really, really negative. But what I want you to hear, we're going to focus today on what it was like for the humans to live and be in relationship with God. And it's actually a story full of grace. We just often don't see the grace in it. So we're going to try to have clearer eyes for the story. So I want us to go ahead and begin reading. I'm going to read to you out of Genesis 3, 1 through 7. The snake was the most intelligent of all the wild animals that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say that you shouldn't eat from any tree in the garden?" And the woman said to the snake, "We may eat the fruit of the garden trees, but not the fruit of the tree in the middle of the garden. God said, 'Don't eat from it and don't touch it or you'll die.'" And the snake said to the woman, "You won't die. God knows that on the day that you eat from it, you will see clearly and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And the woman saw that the tree was beautiful with delicious fruit, and the tree would provide wisdom. So she took some of the fruit and ate it, and she gave some to her husband, and he was with her, and he ate it. And they both saw clearly and knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made garments for themselves. So this is our story today. It's probably familiar to most of you, but I think we need to start out first with dealing with a few misconceptions that most of us have when it comes to this story. Things that we've been taught that aren't actually accurate. And thank goodness for theologians who study these things and help us really accurately understand what is being said here. So the first thing that we need to consider is that this story is not intended to be an explanation of how evil came into the world. That was not how the early readers heard it at all. That was not the intention. That's something we've sort of built into it because in reality, the Bible doesn't answer that question. God simply has chosen not to tell us how evil arrived. So we can ask Him that someday when we stand before Him, but we simply don't know. Neither is it an explanation of how death occurred. In fact, in this story, nobody dies. But people often say, well, this is why we have death. No, that's not what the early author and the early audience would have heard when they heard this story. That is not what was intended. God doesn't explain why death occurs. Number 2, the snake, that evil snake, does not represent Satan or evil. We often like to think of it as symbolically, but no, that's not actually what the author intended or the early hearers heard. The snake itself was a creature in the garden that was especially intelligent. It was also a creature that liked to deceive and stir up trouble. So look at it for what it is. Because everybody has someone in our lives who likes to stir up trouble and get us in trouble, right? There are those kinds of people. They are having a human reality here, and there's always those kind of folks around. And then number 3, this is not a story about the human predicament. It's actually a story of grace. But that's not how we read it. We kind of have a different story around it, but it's meant to be a story of God's grace. It's really more about God than it is the humans. And so as we kind of dive into the story a little bit more, try to take off some of those misconceptions and just maybe hear the story a little more openly. All right. So first of all, what the story teaches us is that God is this great provider. It reveals the giveness of God to all these two folks. You see, God first gives them a vocation. He gives them purpose and meaning to their life, and that is for them to tend to the garden. He also gives them permission to enjoy this gorgeous garden, to explore it, to figure out what life is going to be like. And he also has added a prohibition. And the prohibition is not to eat of 2 of the trees in the garden. Now, when we think of the story, we just think about the prohibition. We don't think about the amazing garden that he understood that people needed a vocation, that they needed purpose and meaning in their life, that he gave them all this permission and freedom. We think about the 2 trees that he said, don't eat from. And we spent a ridiculous amount of time meaning, well, what does it mean? Why would God do that? What do those trees really mean? And so you can see why the woman gets easily deceived and sort of sucked into this conversation, because we do the same thing. We spend more time wondering about that than noticing God's grace in all that he gave to them. You see, God's grace is never cheap. It would be nice if there were no boundaries in life, but there's always boundaries. God has created a world where there are boundaries. And the boundaries are usually around how you treat others and how you treat yourself. And when we break those boundaries, when we ignore those boundaries, we suffer. But grace is never cheap. You see, God understands that the boundaries are the things that keep us healthy and safe and at peace. And so he gives those to us as a gift as well. So, what is this story really about? Well, this is the story of God and humans. That's what you kind of need to see today. So the first thing we learn in this little conversation between a snake and the woman named Eve is that loving boundaries become a threat. So prior to this conversation, God had given them a boundary to keep them safe. But suddenly you have the snake coming in and saying, well, do you think God is really serious about this? Is it really actually accurate? In fact, in Genesis 2, verses 16 through 17, God gives them this loving warning, this loving boundary to keep them safe. He says, eat your fill from all the garden's trees, but don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, because on that day that you eat from it, you're going to die. So it's a loving boundary. Yet when the snake talks about the boundary, he talks about it as a threat. He's already changed the story. And that's going to be the theme of what we're going to talk about today. Our stories are constantly changing. And so he takes something which is a loving safety issue, and he makes it into a threat from God. And that's often how their story of God is, that God gives us rules and the threat that we're going to pay the price if we break them. A lot of people's view of God is around threat. But that's not what it was created to be. It was meant to be this boundary. The next thing we learn is that a God path becomes an alternative path. What I mean by that is that God had given them this purpose and this life, this gift, but suddenly after this conversation with the snake, the woman and the man begin to start thinking that there's alternatives, and the alternative is independence from God. That maybe it isn't all that to be dependent on God, that maybe independence is even greater. I mean, I don't know what our seniors are thinking about as they are going to go off to college, but the reality is what a lot of seniors think about is freedom, right? Freedom, what's that going to be like? No, I remember going on a college tour, and I almost laughed out loud because a woman asked the person giving the tour, is there a time that they have to be in their dorms at night? And I almost started laughing, thinking, oh, honey, you have no idea. They are about to experience freedom. You've prepared them, and they're going to experience freedom. Suddenly, Adam and Eve are thinking, maybe independence is greater. Maybe it's the alternative plan. And I think we kind of do that all the time. I think that's this, we are constantly thinking that instead of something being God's plan, that maybe it's more of an optional plan, right? So through the pandemic, we were forced to stay home, and then we could start coming back, but the studies show that only of those who regularly attended worship, only 70% are going to come back to all denominations. that about 30% have decided that worship is optional. And I can kind of understand it. I have a lot of close friends who said, we're so tired all the time, it's just really nice to stay home. And I'm like, well, are you watching online? Well, I don't really like watching online. And so it's become an optional thing. And I think about that because worship is not meant to be optional. Worship is what we were created for. Worship is this very thing that God made us for, because worship is what sustains us in our faith. In worship, we take communion, which is really the greatest act of maintenance that we can do to stay strong. It's that important. Jesus said do it for a reason. And in worship, we're around community, and so we can be encouraged in our faith, and we can pray together. In worship, we learn about opportunities to serve, because it's hard to go out there and find a way to serve. But we make it easy in worship because we give you these opportunities to be in service. Worship is fundamental to our faith, because we need to sit under the Word. And we're not always so good about reading our Bibles, but you sit under the Word in worship. Worship's not optional. Not if you want to maintain your faith, but somewhere along the line, it becomes an alternative path. And that's what is happening with Adam and Eve, that maybe there's another way of living life. And then when we take another route, a safe place becomes something to avoid. As we know, Adam and Eve both ate of the apple. And what do we read? They suddenly realized they were naked. They didn't feel safe anymore. And this is something I really do think about, because I think it happens when you're young and you leave home, but I also think this happens throughout our lives. We mess up because that's what we do as human beings. But we don't run back to God. Instead, God no longer feels safe. We start creating the story that God's mad at us. We create the story that God doesn't like us, or we're more of the stepchild to God, that God's blessing is going to stop. He's not going to help us as much because we've messed up. And that couldn't be further from the truth, but that's often the story we create. Because we're always creating stories, and often our stories are incorrect. And so then we hide from God, because we're so aware of our brokenness. We're so uncomfortable with who we truly are that we literally avoid God. Because being around God is uncomfortable. There's so many people who say, I don't like to come to church because I just sit and cry. Well, I'm like, that's why you should come to church, to sit and cry. Because you feel closer to God there. And you need a place to be totally real. Peace becomes guilt. You know how that is when you have a relationship with somebody and it's good, and then maybe you have a fight with them or you're uncomfortable and you're filled with guilt? You just avoid them. I mean, it's hard to make up. It's hard to make life right. Sometimes it's easier just to ignore it or just stay away. We should be running to God and saying, God, I did it again. I screwed up bad. But that's not what we do. We just kind of avoid them. I want to encourage any of you, run to Him. And just run to Him. That's the best thing. Don't live with guilt. There's so many things in life to be guilted about. Just run to Him. Joy becomes nakedness and hiding. You see, it's uncomfortable being us then. Remember when you're young and you just feel totally comfortable. You're comfortable to run around naked even. I mean, that should be our relationship with God always. God walked with them daily and spent time with them. And then they ate the apple, and God came and said, why are you hiding from me? That's what we do. When we mess up, we go into hiding. We're ashamed of what we've done. We're ashamed of what we look like. We're ashamed of who we actually are. We are people who have dark thoughts and do dark things, and we get ashamed. And that becomes the bigger story than God's love. Yet the thing about this story is it's about God's grace. That's what we miss. We're all about the failure of the humans, but it's really about God's grace. I mean, God created this beautiful garden, and they live in this garden. It's a gift of grace to them. And the fact that God was worried and knew they needed purpose, that they wouldn't be bored, he gave that to them. That was God's grace. And did you catch that nobody died? God had warned them, and so then people say, well, maybe the snake was right. No. They were warned, and guess what? God extended grace. That's what he does. That's why grace is so hard for us to wrap our brains around, because, well, there was a rule, and now he broke it, and now this is the consequences. There were consequences. Eve had consequences, Adam had consequences, and so did the snake. And they could no longer stay in the garden because it wasn't safe there. But God's grace still followed them. At the very end of chapter 3, there's this little weird statement. It says that God formed leather clothes for them to wear. That's grace. They didn't know how to make leather clothes. They probably had never killed an animal. And God makes them leather clothes to keep them safe outside the garden. And we know he blessed them with children. We don't know how many, but we know of at least 2, but he blessed their family with fertility. He never left their sides. This isn't a story about the fall. The fall happens. We all know that we're sinners. This is a story about the grace that continues to follow us. Yes, there will be consequences, because there always are, but it doesn't separate us from God's grace. The thing that separates us from God's grace is the story we create in our brains that separates us. I always wondered, what did Adam and Eve think after that? Were they like, thank you, God, for not killing and destroying us? Thank you for these kids. Thank you for being with us. Did that the story they had? Or are they like all of us and we kind of create a different story? Let me see if I can give you an example. Like, let's say you get divorced and you interpret that to say, well, I must not be lovable because that person didn't stay with me. And we carry a story of being unlovable the rest of our lives. It's not true. It's just a story we made up in our head, but we believe it. We don't think about, well, what does God say to us about us? No, we just believe the story because we have to create a story because we're in pain. I'll share one from my childhood that is so common from what I've read that I bet a bunch of you have this similar story in some area. When I was in the 7th grade, I loved math. I liked math all through elementary, and I'm in 7th grade. I had the best math teacher. He was wonderful. And he just taught it, and it just made sense, and I had joy in completing the answers. I wasn't a great student. I was probably a B student. But it didn't matter in math because I loved it. It didn't matter. One night we had a open house, when you bring your parents to school at night, and we were going classroom to classroom, and I introduced them to my teacher. And then I heard him talking to them. And he said, Jane's really a delightful student. It's just, it's too bad that she's so careless. During the week, she always gets the concept, but on Friday when she takes the test, she's so careless. She doesn't seem to care. She puts the decimal in the wrong spaces. She mixes up her number, like the answer's 81, and she puts 18, and she's just so careless. And I listened to that, and I was so embarrassed and horrified. And I thought, how can math be like this thing I love if I'm so bad at it? If my teacher's ashamed of me? And you know what? I never liked math again. It ended. I struggled with math all through high school. It wasn't easy anymore. In my 30s, I found out I have dyslexia. Back in the 70s, no one talked about learning disabilities. Maybe, who knows, we'll never know, maybe I wasn't so bad at math. Maybe I just had an issue that I didn't know how to manage. It's funny, to this day, if I'm going to have a stress dream, it's usually around a math test. I told myself a story that wasn't true, and I believed it, and I carried it. And that's what I want to encourage everyone today. Yes, you go into the world and you're going to mess up, because that's what we do. But what is the story you tell yourself? Does it include the truths of God? You see, because there's some really, really important truths of God. Brene Brown, who talks a lot about the stories we make up, says the most dangerous stories we make up are the narratives that diminish our inherent worthiness. God gives us inherent worthiness because we're his children, because he loves us. So here are some truths about us. This is a thing you need to carry with you. This should be part of your story. We were created by God to be in relationship with him. We were literally created for that very reason. Revelation 3:20 says, "Here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me." You eat with the people you want to be in fellowship with. You eat with the people that you want to have a relationship with. God is waiting, knocking at the door. This is not just for new Christians. This is for old Christians. This is for all of us, because so often we walk away from God, but he's always pursuing us. The second thing is we're loved by God. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world, he gave us his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." Which one of us around here are willing to give up our child for the sake of humanity? Nobody. Yet God's love is so deep for us, that is what he did. No one loves us more than God. We're pursued by God, but never coerced. Zephaniah 3:17 says, "The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love, and he will exalt you with loud singing." God's doing a party over us all the time. He is absolutely having a party in our honor. But he is never going to force you into relationship. You have free will. You can always choose to eat the apple. But he's not going to stop having that same love and celebration over you. His love for us just doesn't end. And our last one is we are accepted by God. John 3:37 says, "Anyone whom the Father gives to me will come to me, and I won't send anyone away who comes to me." This is unconditional love. That means if you're in a good place, you're in a horrible place, you're mad at God, you've just messed up your whole life, you're mean to everybody, it doesn't matter. You just come and God accepts you. Because his story of you is all around his love. What is your story telling you? I hope your story includes the story of God and his grace, his mercy, and his acceptance.